The Atlantic wind carved faces into the cliffs of County Mayo. 1870. A nation still bleeding from famine, still burying its children in unmarked graves where the soil refused to take root. Grace O'Malley, named for a pirate queen her mother barely remembered, was born into this landscape of absence. Her first breath tasted of salt and deprivation. Records from the parish of Achill Island describe her family with clinical brevity. Fisherman, destitute. 5 children survived to age 3. Grace, the eldest, exhibited uncommon resilience. What the ledger did not record were the mornings she woke to find another sibling cold beside her. What it could not capture was the hunger that became her second language. Not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but the chronic gnawing erasure that taught her body to expect nothing. By 15, Grace possessed a gaze that unnerved the local priest. Too observant, he noted in a letter to the diocese, watches the landlord's men with unseemly comprehension. She had learned early that survival required reading silences, the pause before her father admitted the nets were empty again, the way her mother's hands trembled when counting coins that would never be enough. Grace absorbed injustice through her skin, storing it in a place behind her ribs where it hardened into something sharp and unforgiving. 1885. The family emigrated, not fled. Emigration suggested choice, and there was none. Steerage across the Atlantic, bodies pressed into darkness, vomit and seawater mixing on wooden floors, the constant sound of praying and retching. Grace, at 15, did not pray. She watched, observed how the crew treated Irish passengers like cargo, noted which women disappeared into crew quarters at night and returned with bruises shaped like fingerprints. She said nothing. Witnesses learned silence or learned to drown. New York swallowed them whole. Her father found work on the docks, irregular, brutal, paid in whiskey and broken promises. Her mother took in washing until her hands cracked and bled into the rich men's linens. Grace, too tall and too watchful to be considered properly feminine, was hired as a domestic servant. The employment agency's notation: strong constitution, literate, lacks appropriate deference, but can be trained. Manhattan, 1890. Grace entered service at the brownstone of Dr. Elias Hawthorne on Fifth Avenue. 3 stories of pristine moral authority. Dr. Hawthorne, philanthropist, alienist, published authority on female nervous disorders, maintained the household with military precision. Grace scrubbed floors that already gleamed, polished silver that bore no tarnish, learned that cleanliness here was not about dirt, but about erasing evidence of human presence. She was invisible, which gave her the freedom to see everything. Late autumn evenings after the family retired, she emptied wastebaskets, straightened the study. It was during these silent hours that she began to notice patterns. Ledgers left carelessly open, correspondence discussing charitable donations to institutions with names like Willowbrook, Blackwell's, Manhattan State. The amounts were staggering. The language was careful, clinical, stripped of humanity. Continued funding for therapeutic experimentation, acquisition of suitable subjects, disposal protocols for unsuccessful interventions. Grace read quickly, her heart a fist in her throat. She replaced papers exactly as she'd found them, said nothing to the other servants, who had learned that knowledge was a luxury the poor could not afford. December 1894. A visitor arrived after midnight. Grace, sleeping in the servants' quarters in the attic, woke to the sound of the front door. She crept to the stairwell, pressing herself into shadow. Below, in the foyer's gaslight, Dr. Hawthorne greeted a man whose coat bore the institutional stench of carbolic and something underneath it. Rot, barely masked. Their voices rose through the stairwell like smoke. "The Board of Governors grows impatient," the visitor said. His voice had the texture of wet stone. "Willowbrook requires demonstration of results. The investors expect returns on their patronage." "They shall have them," Hawthorne replied. "We've refined the protocols. Prolonged deprivation combined with isolation produces remarkable compliance. The female subjects prove particularly susceptible. Properly managed, we can extend observation periods to Spare me the medical poetry, Elias. How many? A pause. Grace's breath caught. 12 in the past quarter, natural causes according to records. No inquiries, no families to complain. Hawthorne's tone carried the satisfaction of a man solving arithmetic. The bodies have been repurposed. The medical schools pay handsomely for fresh specimens. Grace's hand found her mouth, stifling sound. The visitor laughed, not with humor, but with the mechanical efficiency of a man confirming a transaction. And the new donations? Secured. We'll receive another 20 inconvenient women by spring. Hysteria, moral insanity, the usual diagnoses. No one questions an alienist's professional judgment. They moved toward the study. The door closed. Grace remained frozen on the stairs for 7 minutes. She counted each one, her pulse a drumbeat of new and terrible knowing. She understood then what she had witnessed. Not charity, conspiracy. Women bought and sold and erased under the banner of medical progress. Grace descended the stairs, returned to her narrow bed, did not sleep. In the morning she made a decision that would seal her fate. She would not remain silent. She would not be complicit. She would expose what she had heard, even if exposure meant her own erasure. She did not yet know that Hawthorne's institutions had perfected the art of making inconvenient witnesses disappear. She did not yet know that she had just become one. Winter 1895 arrived with the kind of cold that felt personal. Grace continued her duties with mechanical precision, but everything had shifted. The brownstone, once merely oppressive, now felt like a mausoleum where she polished the instruments of murder. She began to document. Nothing overt. Servants who showed too much interest in their employer's affairs found themselves dismissed without reference, or worse. But Grace possessed the patience hunger had taught her. She memorized names from discarded correspondence, noted dates when Hawthorne received visitors who smelled of institutions, observed which ledger pages he burned in the study fireplace and which he merely filed away. February brought opportunity. Mrs. Hawthorne fell ill, not seriously, but enough to require her husband's sustained attention. The household routine fractured. During 3 hours when the doctor attended his wife's bedside, Grace entered his study with a feather duster and a pretext. The filing cabinet stood against the north wall, mahogany and brass, locked but not impossible. Her father had taught her things before whiskey destroyed him, including how to open locks designed to keep poor people out of rich people's secrets. 30 seconds. The drawer slid open with a whisper. Inside, files organized with pathological precision. Willowbrook Asylum for the Feeble-Minded and Insane. Patient acquisition reports. Financial disbursements. And, Grace's hands began to shake, mortality records. Subject 247, female, age 19, Irish, cause of death. Cardiac failure secondary to therapeutic starvation. Duration, 87 days. Observations. Subject maintained consciousness until day 76. Resistance to protocol diminished significantly after day 40. Body weight reduced by 64%. Organs harvested for study. Specimen quality, excellent. The clinical language could not mask what Grace understood. This was murder. Systematic. Profitable. Documented. She photographed nothing. She had no camera, no means. Instead, she committed to memory. Names, dates, the careful accounting of how much each body sold for, how many women had entered Willowbrook and never left, how the diagnoses were fabricated. Moral insanity for women who refused marriage proposals. Nymphomania for factory workers who'd borne children out of wedlock. Hysteria for anyone who questioned authority. Grace was memorizing the 53rd name when she heard footsteps in the corridor. She replaced the files, locked the cabinet, and was dusting the windowsill when Dr. Hawthorne entered. He paused, looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time since she'd entered his employment. Grace, he said slowly, as if testing the shape of her name in his mouth. How long have you been in this room? Just arrived, sir. Mrs. Hawthorne requested fresh flowers for your desk. There were no flowers in her hands. Hawthorne's eyes, pale, surgical, examined her face. You're trembling. The cold, sir. Of course. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who dissected things. Grace, you've been with us for how long? 5 years, sir. 5 years. And you've been satisfactory. Quiet. Unremarkable. He moved closer. Tell me, do you read? The trap crystallized. Only what's required, sir. Recipes, shopping lists. Nothing else? Not, say, private correspondence left carelessly about? Grace met his gaze, held it. I wouldn't presume, sir. The moment stretched like wire pulled taut. Then Hawthorne laughed, a brief, mirthless exhalation. No, of course not. You may go. Grace left, walked to the kitchen, continued with her duties. But she knew. He knew she knew. What happened next occurred with the efficiency of a mousetrap. 3 days later, Grace received a message. Her mother had taken ill and requested her presence. She was granted leave. She went, found her mother weak but not dying, confused by Grace's sudden arrival. No one sent for you, child. Grace returned to the brownstone, found her belongings packed, her position terminated. The housekeeper delivered the news with bureaucratic detachment. Dr. Hawthorne has determined your services are no longer required. He has, however, arranged alternative accommodation for you, given your family's circumstances. What accommodation? The housekeeper handed her an envelope. Inside, a medical certificate signed by Elias Hawthorne, MD, alienist. Patient exhibits acute hysterical delusions, specifically paranoid fixations regarding imagined conspiracies. Claims to have witnessed conversations and documentation that do not exist. Demonstrates moral insanity and potential danger to herself and others. Recommends immediate psychiatric intervention and indefinite institutionalization for her own protection and the safety of society. Diagnosis: hysteria, acute, delusional ideation, moral deficiency. Grace read it twice. The words remained unchanged. This is a lie. The doctor is a respected authority on female nervous disorders, the housekeeper said. He would not make such a diagnosis lightly. I'm not insane. That's what they all say, dear. 2 men arrived within the hour. Not police. Hawthorne was too careful for official channels. Private contractors from Willowbrook itself, dressed in civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide their institutional bearing. They carried restraints wrapped in velvet. Miss O'Malley, the taller one said, we're here to escort you to a place where you can receive proper care. I don't need care. I'm not sick. The doctor says otherwise. We have legal authority. He produced papers, commitment documents signed by Hawthorne in his capacity as both physician and concerned citizen who had observed her deteriorating mental state. Grace looked at the housekeeper, the other servants, the cook who'd shared bread with her. No one met her eyes. She could scream, fight, run. But she'd watched her whole life what happened to Irish girls who fought men with authority. They lost. They always lost. The men approached with professional gentleness. One held her arm. The other opened a black leather bag. This will make the journey more comfortable, he said, producing a syringe. Please, Grace whispered. I'm not mad, I'm a witness. I know what he's in. The needle entered her arm. The world tilted, softened, began to dissolve. Her last clear memory before darkness, being carried to a windowless carriage. The sound of horses. The smell of carbolic and rot. And through the chemical fog, Hawthorne's voice close to her ear. A whisper meant only for her. Inconvenient women vanish every day, Grace. You should have remained unremarkable. The carriage door closed. The lock engaged. The horses began to move, carrying her north toward the Hudson, toward Willowbrook, toward a red brick fortress where women were filed away like failed experiments. She had become subject 341. Female, age 25. Irish, diagnosis hysteria. Expected duration of observation, indefinite. No one would come for her. No one ever came. Grace woke to the smell of ammonia and human waste, inadequately masked by carbolic acid. The ceiling above her was water-stained plaster, cracked into patterns that resembled anatomical diagrams. For 3 seconds, she did not remember. Then, memory returned like a fist to the sternum. Willowbrook Asylum for the Feeble-Minded and Insane. March 1895. The admission ward held 42 women in a space designed for 20. Iron beds lined walls that wept condensation. No privacy curtains. No personal possessions. The windows, narrow, barred, positioned too high to see anything but sky, admitted light the color of old teeth. A matron approached. Substantial woman, keys hanging from her belt like trophies. Subject 341, on your feet. My name is Grace O'Malley. The matron consulted a ledger. Says here you're delusional. Thinks she has a name, they all do at first. She smiled without warmth. You'll learn. Stand for inspection. Grace stood. Her clothes had been removed while she'd been unconscious. The thought made her skin crawl. She now wore a gray institutional shift, shapeless and coarse, with a number stenciled across the back in black paint. 341. Turn. Grace turned, felt eyes cataloging her body like livestock at market. Hair needs cutting, lice protocol, marker for delousing. The matron made a notation. Dr. Voss will see you at 1400 hours. Until then, orientation. Orientation meant rules delivered in monotone. No speaking without permission. No eye contact with staff. No questions. No resistance to treatment. No communication with the outside. Letters would be confiscated. Visitors were prohibited during the adjustment period. Typically 6 months, often extended indefinitely. What if my family inquires? A woman asked. Young, perhaps 19, still possessed of the delusion that rules applied equally to everyone. Your family signed commitment papers, the matron replied. They've entrusted your care to medical professionals. They won't inquire. The woman began to cry. The matron ignored her. Grace was processed through a series of degradations designed to strip identity. Delousing. Ice-cold water in a tiled room, harsh soap that burned, hands that were not gentle. Hair cutting. Her dark Irish curls sheared to within an inch of her scalp, falling to the floor like surrendered flags. Medical examination. Invasive. Conducted by a physician who never met her eyes, who dictated observations to a nurse as if Grace were a specimen rather than a person. Subject exhibits physical resistance, musculature developed from manual labor. No obvious signs of venereal disease or pregnancy. Menstruation irregular, likely due to malnutrition pre-admission. Mental state, alert but non-compliant. Recommend isolation protocol to establish behavioral compliance. Afterward, Grace was led through corridors that seemed to multiply as they walked. The asylum was vast, 3 floors above ground, rumored levels below. Gothic architecture repurposed for institutional efficiency. High ceilings that made voices echo. Stone floors that amplified footsteps. Gas lamps that created more shadow than light. They passed a day room where women sat in rows, rocking, silent. A dining hall where thin gruel was being served in tin bowls. An isolation corridor where screams leaked from behind locked doors. Grace was assigned to Ward C, chronic cases, the matron explained. Women who would likely never leave. The ward held 63 patients in varying states of deterioration. Some sat catatonic, others paced endless circles, wearing paths in the already worn floor. One woman stood at the barred window, pressing her face against iron, whispering names of children she'd likely never see again. Grace was shown to her bed. Thin mattress, thinner blanket, no pillow. The woman in the adjacent bed watched her with eyes that had learned not to hope. First time? The woman whispered when the matron departed. Grace nodded. You'll learn the rules, real rules, not the ones they tell you. The woman's voice was thread thin, careful. Don't drink the water after medication rounds, they dose it. Don't volunteer for therapy sessions, you don't come back the same. Don't trust the ones who smile, especially not Dr. Voss. What did they diagnose you with? Grace asked. Melancholia, my husband wanted to remarry. Difficult to divorce a sane woman, easy to commit an insane one. She smiled without humor. I've been here 11 years. I was 23 when I arrived. Grace did the arithmetic. Felt her throat close. That night, dinner was served. Watery cabbage soup, a slice of bread that tasted of sawdust, weak tea. Grace forced herself to eat, remembering the files she'd read. Therapeutic starvation. She would need strength. But around her, she noticed, portions were meager. Women whispered about hunger between the hunger. Some were skeletal, eyes too large for their faces. Others bore the bloated look of malnutrition disguised as weight. An older woman, thin as winter, leaned close. They control us through our bellies. Some wards get more, some get less. Depends on how much you resist. Grace looked at her bowl, made a decision that would define everything that followed. "I won't eat," she said quietly. "Not until they acknowledge what this place really is." The woman stared. "You'll die." "Then I'll die as Grace O'Malley, not Subject 341. Word spread through whispers. By morning, 12 women had joined her protest. Quiet resistance, solidarity and refusal. By afternoon, Grace was summoned to Dr. Reginald Voss's office. The superintendent sat behind a desk of polished oak, incongruous in this place of institutional decay. He was younger than Grace expected, 40 perhaps. Well-dressed, cultured voice, the kind of man who attended symphony and discussed philosophy over brandy. "Miss O'Malley," he said, smiling, "I understand you've been refusing nourishment. I've been refusing complicity." Voss's smile widened. "Fascinating. Dr. Hawthorne warned me you were articulate. It's rare, you know, genuine intelligence in our patient population. Most are simply hysterical or deficient. But you..." He opened a file. Her file. "You're different, which makes you valuable." "Valuable how?" "As a subject. We've been refining protocols for managing resistant patients. Prolonged observation during voluntary starvation could yield significant data." He leaned forward. "How long do you think you can last, Grace?" She understood then. Her protest had become their experiment. "We'll monitor you closely," Voss continued. "Daily measurements, cognitive assessments, physical deterioration markers. You'll be quite comfortable in one of our observation rooms. Private, quiet, perfect for extended study. And if I resume eating, then you'll be just another compliant patient, unremarkable, safe." His smile turned surgical. "But somehow, I don't think you'll choose compliance. Inconvenient women never do." 2 orderlies entered, larger than necessary. Grace did not struggle. She'd already learned that particular futility. They took her down, not to another ward but below, basement levels where the gas lamps flickered and the walls sweated perpetual damp. The isolation cell measured 8 feet by 6. Stone walls, no window. A single bed bolted to the floor. A bucket in the corner. A door with a slot for observation. They locked her inside. In the darkness, Grace pressed her hand against the cold stone and made a promise to herself, to the women she'd read about in Hawthorne's files, to all the inconvenient witnesses who'd been erased. She would not disappear quietly, even if silence was all they'd leave her. The body begins betraying itself around day 3. Grace learned this not from medical texts, but from the intimate tutorial of her own deterioration. Day 1. The isolation cell existed in perpetual twilight. No natural light reached this depth. Time became theoretical, measured only by the slot in the door opening 3 times: morning, noon, evening. Each time, a tray appeared. Oatmeal, bread, water. Each time, Grace left it untouched. A voice through the slot. "You'll eat eventually. They all do." Grace said nothing. Speech required energy, and she was learning to hoard it. Day 2. Hunger sharpened from discomfort to pain. Her stomach cramped, a fist clenching and unclenching. Headache bloomed behind her eyes. She lay on the thin mattress, conserving movement. The cell's darkness pressed against her eyelids even when they were open. Footsteps approached. The observation slot scraped open. "Doctor." Voss's voice, clinically curious. "Subject 341, baseline measurements. Stand, please." Grace stood, swayed, gripped the wall. A nurse entered with instruments. Weight, 142 pounds. Blood pressure, elevated. Pulse, rapid. Cognitive assessment. Grace recited numbers backward, identified objects. answered questions about date and location. The nurse recorded everything in a leather-bound journal. "Fascinating," Voss murmured. "At this stage, most subjects show compromised cognition, but you remain precise." He smiled. "This will be quite illuminating." They left. The slot closed. Darkness returned. Day 4. The hunger changed character. Less pain, more absence. Grace's body, receiving no fuel, began consuming itself. She could feel it, a strange internal cannibalism, muscle converting to energy. Fat reserves depleting. Her ribs grew visible, hip bones pressed against institutional fabric. Hallucinations began subtly. Shadows moved in peripheral vision. The darkness whispered in her mother's voice. "Why are you doing this? Why not just eat and survive?" Because survival without witness is erasure, Grace thought but did not say aloud. If she ate, she became compliant. Another woman filed away. Another voice silenced. Day 7. Time became elastic. Hours stretched like warm glass. Grace slept in fragments, waking disoriented, unsure if minutes or days had passed. Her body temperature dropped. The cell's constant chill burrowed into her bones. She shivered continuously, burning calories she could not afford to lose. The slot opened. A different voice, female, softer than the others. "Please eat something, anything." Grace turned her head. Through the narrow opening, she glimpsed a woman's face. Not a matron, younger, perhaps 30. Eyes that held something other than institutional indifference. "Who are you?" Grace's voice cracked from disuse. "Nurse Sarah Brennan." "Ooh, I've been reading your file. What they're doing to you." She glanced over her shoulder, lowered her voice. "This isn't treatment. It's torture disguised as science." "Then help me expose it." "I can't. I'd lose my position, possibly worse." "Then bear witness," Grace whispered. "Remember, when I'm gone, remember what they did." Sarah's face disappeared. The slot closed. But through it, so quietly, Grace almost missed it. "I will." Day 14. Grace no longer felt hunger. The pain had passed, leaving only a hollow sensation, as if her body were becoming transparent. She could see her pulse in her wrists, blue veins prominent against skin that had taken on a translucent quality. New symptoms emerged. Hair fell out in clumps, gums bled, bruises appeared without cause, purple flowers blooming across her arms, her legs, evidence of blood vessels failing. Her heart stuttered irregularly, a clock winding down. Voss visited daily now, always with his journal, always with that expression of scientific satisfaction. Remarkable endurance. Most subjects at this stage have either capitulated or lost consciousness. But you remain present. "I remain Grace O'Malley," she said. Each word cost her. "Do you?" Voss tilted his head. "Or are you becoming what we document you as? Subject 341, a case study in voluntary deterioration." Grace closed her eyes. In the darkness behind them, she saw the files she'd memorized. Subject 247, Subject 189, Subject 103. Women reduced to numbers, their deaths recorded as data points. She would not let them erase her name. Day 23. Grace's mind began playing tricks. The cell walls receded and advanced. Sometimes she was 8 years old again, watching her sister die of hunger in County Mayo. Sometimes she was in Hawthorne's study, reading her own death certificate before it had been written. Voices leaked through the door. Not hallucinations, real voices. Women in other cells, other experiments. How long has she been refusing? One voice. Almost a month. Voss is delighted. Says she's proving his hypothesis about willpower and physiological collapse. Another voice. What happens when she dies? A pause. Then, same as always, natural causes. Cardiac failure secondary to pre-existing mental instability. No one questions it. Grace understood. They were waiting, watching, documenting her death in real time. Day 31. Grace could no longer stand unassisted. 2 orderlies carried her to a gurney for daily measurements. Weight, 118 pounds. a loss of 24 pounds. Her body cannibalizing itself, consuming muscle, organ tissue, anything to stay alive just a little longer. But her mind, her treacherous, enduring mind, remained sharp. Sharper, perhaps, than before. Hunger had stripped away everything extraneous. What remained was pure will, refined to its essence. Sarah appeared during evening rounds, slipped a scrap of paper through the slot when no one watched. Grace unfolded it with trembling fingers. 4 words, written in careful script. "They're testing other women." Grace pressed the paper to her chest, closed her eyes. The hunger was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them. Every woman starved, shocked, lobotomized, erased in the name of therapeutic progress. Day 40. Voss entered the cell personally. Unusual. He stood over Grace's prone form, studying her with the detachment of a lepidopterist examining a pinned butterfly. "You're dying," he said matter-of-factly. "Your organs are beginning to fail. Kidney function is compromised. Heart arrhythmia is increasing. I estimate 2 weeks, perhaps 3, before complete systemic collapse." Grace's lips moved. Voss leaned closer. What was that? She gathered every particle of remaining strength, opened her eyes, met his gaze. "Good," she whispered. "Then you'll have 2 weeks to explain to your investors why their prize subject exposed your operation before she died." Voss's expression flickered. "What are you talking about?" "The nurse, Sarah Brennan, she's been documenting, taking notes. She knows what you're doing here." Grace smiled, a death's head grin. "Inconvenient witnesses don't always stay silent, Doctor." It was a bluff, mostly. But she saw it land. Voss stood abruptly, left without another word. Through the door, muffled but audible, Grace heard him bark orders. "Find Nurse Brennan. I want her in my office, now." Grace lay in the darkness, her body failing, her heart still beating its defiant rhythm. She had 8 months left to live. She had just made them count. Day 120, 4 months without food. Grace O'Malley weighed 97 pounds. Medical literature would later describe her survival as physiologically improbable. The human body, deprived of nutrition, typically expires between 60 and 90 days. But Grace had inherited her ancestors' famine-resistant metabolism. Centuries of Irish starvation encoded in her cells, teaching her body to extract energy from nothing, to endure beyond reasonable limits. She was dying, but slowly, methodically, with documentary precision. The isolation cell had become her entire universe. 8 feet by 6, stone walls mapped by touch. She knew every crack, every stain, every place where moisture collected. Time no longer moved forward. It circled, a vulture waiting for her to stop breathing. Night of day 123. The slot opened, not feeding time. Wrong hour. Sarah Brennan's face appeared, eyes wide with something between fear and determination. "They're moving me," she whispered urgently, "transferring me to the men's ward. Voss knows I've been sympathetic. This is my last chance." Grace dragged herself upright. Movement cost her. Everything cost her now. "Listen carefully," Sarah continued. "Night rounds start in 8 minutes. The orderly on this level, Morrison, he drinks. Falls asleep in the storage room every night around 2. The keys hang on his belt. If you can reach the corridor, there's a records room. 3rd door past the stairs. It's not always locked." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Because I can't save you. But maybe you can save yourself, or at least..." She paused. "Leave evidence. Something they can't burn or bury." She pressed something through the slot. A small metal tool, a nail file, sharpened to a point. "For the lock," Sarah whispered. "I'm sorry I can't do more." The slot closed. Footsteps receded. Grace held the makeshift tool, felt its weight, understood what it represented. Not escape, but possibility. A chance to transform suffering into testimony. 2 hours later she heard it, snoring, distant but distinct. Morrison, faithful to his habits. Grace approached the cell door. Her hands shook. Malnutrition had destroyed fine motor control. The lock was simple, designed to keep the insane contained, not the determined. She worked by feel, by memory of her father's lessons, by pure necessity. 15 minutes. The lock clicked. The door opened. The corridor stretched before her, dimly lit by gas lamps turned low. Grace stepped out, her bare feet silent on cold stone. Each step required negotiation with a body that wanted to collapse. She moved along the wall, using it for support. Third door past the stairs. Unlocked as Sarah promised. Inside, file cabinets, dozens of them. Floor to ceiling. The archive of erasure. Grace pulled open drawers at random. Manila folders spilled their secrets. Patient records dating back to 1850. Admission forms. Treatment logs. Death certificates. She found what she was looking for in the third cabinet. Experimental protocol files. Restricted access. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder labeled Therapeutic Starvation Study, Female Subjects, 1889-1895. The pages documented systematic murder dressed in scientific language. Subject 103, age 24, Irish immigrant. Admitted for moral insanity. Refused arranged marriage. Starvation protocol initiated day 1. Death occurred day 68. Autopsy revealed complete organ failure, muscle wasting, bone marrow depletion. Cause of death recorded as natural cardiac arrest secondary to hysteria. Body sold to Cornell Medical College for $47. Subject after subject. 23 women before Grace, each one starved, each death monetized. Each file containing the same notation at the bottom. Funding source, Hawthorne Medical Trust. Research approved by Board of Governors. Grace kept reading, found worse. A section labeled Forced Sterilization Program. Women subjected to surgical procedures without consent, without anesthesia in many cases. The justification, preventing the procreation of the feeble-minded. The reality, eugenics disguised as therapy. Another section, electroconvulsive experimentation. Voltage levels. Duration. Effects on memory, personality, compliance. One entry made her stomach twist. Subject 237 subjected to sustained electrical current for 47 minutes. Result, complete personality erasure. Subject no longer recognizes own name. Highly compliant. Experiment deemed successful. But the worst, the absolute worst, was buried in a folder marked financial records. A ledger documenting payments received for deceased patient bodies. Medical schools paid between $40 and $75 per corpse, depending on condition and cause of death. But there were other buyers. Private physicians conducting unauthorized research, pharmaceutical companies testing drugs on dead tissue, even wealthy collectors of medical oddities. Grace calculated quickly. Over 6 years, Willowbrook had processed 347 patient deaths. At an average of $50 per body, that was over $17,000 in unreported revenue. They were farming human beings for profit. Her vision blurred, not tears. Her dehydrated body could no longer produce them. The blurring came from malnutrition, from her brain receiving insufficient oxygen, from the sheer horror of what she was reading. She needed to take something. Evidence. Proof. Grace folded several pages, slipping them into the waistband of her institutional shift. The paper crinkled against her skeletal frame. Behind her, a sound. Footsteps. Grace turned. The door stood open. In the threshold. Not Morrison, not an orderly. Another patient. A woman Grace recognized from Ward C before her isolation. Older, perhaps 50. Gray hair shorn close. Her eyes held the glazed quality of heavy medication, but beneath it, something else. Recognition. "You're the one who stopped eating," the woman whispered. Grace nodded. "They did this to my daughter 3 years ago. She was 16, diagnosed with nymphomania because she loved a man they didn't approve of." The woman's voice was flat, emptied of affect by years of pharmaceutical suppression. "They starved her. I received a letter saying she died of natural causes. I never believed it." "What was her name?" Margaret Chen. She was subject 189. Grace had read that file, knew exactly how Margaret had died, knew it had taken 71 days, Knew her body had been sold for $52. "I'm going to expose this," Grace said. "All of it. I promise you." The woman smiled sadly. "You won't live long enough. Look at you, you're already a ghost." "Then I'll haunt them." The woman stepped closer, reached into her own shift, pulled out a folded piece of paper, wrinkled, stained, carefully preserved. "I took this from the director's office 2 years ago. Didn't know what to do with it. Couldn't read most of it, they've medicated me stupid, but you—" She pressed it into Grace's hand. "You can use it." Grace unfolded the document. Her heart, weak and irregular, stuttered. It was a contract between Willowbrook Asylum and the Hawthorne Medical Trust, signed by Dr. Elias Hawthorne, Dr. Reginald Voss, and 3 other men whose names Grace recognized. Prominent physicians, board members of multiple institutions, pillars of New York society. The contract outlined terms, guaranteed funding in exchange for suitable research subjects, profit sharing from body sales, and complete legal immunity for all experimental procedures. At the bottom, a handwritten note, "Discretion paramount." Any exposure would destroy all parties involved. Grace looked up. "Thank you." The woman was already leaving, paused at the door. "My name was Elizabeth, before they made me Subject 278. Remember that too." She disappeared into the corridor. Grace folded the contract, added it to her collection, turned to leave. Morrison stood in the doorway. He wasn't drunk, wasn't asleep. He'd been watching. Morrison was not a large man, but Grace weighed 97 pounds and could barely stand. The arithmetic of violence was not in her favor. He stepped into the records room, closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was very loud. "Well," he said quietly, "this is irregular." Grace's fingers tightened on the folded documents. Her last weapon was worthless if she couldn't preserve it. Morrison studied her with eyes that had seen too much institutional horror to register shock. "You know what happens to patients found out of their cells?" "Punishment," Grace whispered. "Worse. Voss has a special treatment for the rebellious. Ice baths, extended restraints. Sometimes—" He paused. "Sometimes they just increase the dosages until you forget you were ever a person." Grace waited. Dying either way, might as well die with the truth in her hands. "But here's my problem," Morrison continued. He sat down on a filing cabinet casual, as if they were discussing weather. "I've worked here 11 years, seen a lot, tried not to see more, tried to convince myself this was employment, not complicity." He looked at the documents in her hand. "What did you find?" Grace made a calculation, showed him the contract. Morrison read. His jaw tightened. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. "I have a daughter," he said. 15 years old, smart, opinionated, the kind of girl who questions things. He folded the contract carefully, handed it back. "The kind of girl who could end up in a place like this if she questions the wrong person. Then help me. I'm nobody, a night orderly who drinks too much. Who would listen? Keep me alive long enough to get these documents out." Morrison laughed bitterly. "You've been refusing food for 4 months. Look at yourself. You're not going to survive another week." "Then I need that week." He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Return to your cell. I'll report the door was faulty, lock didn't catch, but Grace—" He used her name, not her number. "I can't protect you from Voss. Nobody can." Grace nodded. Let Morrison escort her back to the isolation cell. Let him lock the door. Let the familiar darkness swallow her again. She pressed the stolen documents against her chest. Evidence, testimony, the voices of 23 dead women, given form in bureaucratic precision. Day 135. Grace's body entered the terminal phase. Her kidneys, stressed beyond capacity, began to fail. Urine turned dark, almost black. Edema swelled her ankles, her wrists, fluid accumulating because her organs could no longer process it. Voss visited with increased frequency, documenting her decline with scientific enthusiasm. "Fascinating. Your cognitive function remains surprisingly intact despite obvious multi-organ failure. The brain, it seems, is the last thing hunger destroys." He made notes. How do you feel? Like a case study, he smiled. You are a case study, a remarkable one. When you expire, your contribution to medical knowledge will be substantial. When I expire, Grace said slowly, your career will be over. Bold claim for a woman who can't stand unassisted. I don't need to stand, I just need to be remembered. After he left, Grace lay in the darkness and felt her body systematically shutting down. Heart palpitations that left her gasping, muscle cramps that locked her joints, a metallic taste in her mouth, her gums bleeding constantly now, her teeth loosening in their sockets. She thought about the women in Hawthorne's files, wondered if they'd felt this same slow dissolution, this gradual separation of consciousness from flesh. Day 147. Sarah Brennan appeared at the slot, no longer in nurse's uniform. She'd been demoted to orderly work, punishment for her sympathy. I'm being transferred, she whispered, to Blackwell's Island. They're removing everyone who might testify about conditions here. The documents, Grace said. I have them, evidence of everything. Sarah's eyes widened. How? Morrison. The night orderly. He's complicit through silence, but he has a daughter. That makes him vulnerable to conscience. Grace pressed the folded papers against the slot. Take these. Get them out. They search us every shift change. Then hide them. Swallow them if you must, but get them out. Sarah reached through, hands trembling, took the documents, stared at them as if they might detonate. This is a death sentence, she whispered, for all of us. If they catch me, then we'll die knowing we fought. That's more than most get. Sarah nodded, tucked the papers into her undergarments. There's something else. I overheard Voss talking to Hawthorne. They're planning to end your observation. You've lasted too long. You're becoming an embarrassment. They're going to induce cardiac arrest, make it look natural. Grace felt no surprise. When? Soon. Days, maybe. Sarah's voice broke. I'm sorry. I thought if I bore witness, if I remembered, it would matter. But it doesn't matter if no one outside these walls knows. It will matter, Grace said, even if we don't live to see it. Sarah left. Grace lay back on her mattress, feeling her heart's irregular rhythm, counting the beats, wondering which one would be the last. Yoyin 56, a commotion in the corridor outside, shouting, running feet. Then silence, sudden and complete. The slot opened. Not Morrison, not Sarah. Doctor. Hawthorne. He looked older than Grace remembered, thinner. The months had not been kind to him either. Grace, he said softly. Do you know what you've done? Exposed you. You've exposed nothing. A few stolen papers that will be explained as the ravings of a mentally ill patient. We've already prepared the narrative. You fabricated documents during psychotic episodes, created elaborate conspiracy theories, classic paranoid delusion. He smiled. We're very good at controlling narratives. Then why are you here? Hawthorne's smile faded. Because I underestimated you. I thought hunger would break you. Instead, you've turned it into a weapon. You've inspired other patients, created unrest. Nurse Brennan was caught trying to smuggle documents out. She's been committed herself now, conveniently diagnosed with the same condition we gave you. He paused. But the problem is, even silenced, you remain a symbol. As long as you're alive, you're dangerous. Then kill me. We will, humanely, tonight. A dose of digitalis in your evening water, your heart will stop. We'll record it as natural progression of self-induced starvation. No one will question it. Grace closed her eyes. 7 months of suffering for nothing. Evidence confiscated. Allies silenced. Her death imminent and unremarkable. But, Hawthorne continued, I'm offering you a choice. Recant. Publicly admit your accusations were delusions. Return to normal patient status. Resume eating. Live. Live as what? Subject 341. Live as a cautionary tale. A recovered patient who overcame her mental illness through proper treatment. Think of it. You'd be proof our methods work. Grace opened her eyes, met his gaze, gathered the last fragments of her strength. "I choose death," she whispered. "Because dead, I'm evidence. Alive and recanting, I'm complicit." Hawthorne stood. So be it. He left. The slot closed. Grace lay in darkness, waiting for evening, waiting for poison disguised as mercy. But she'd made one calculation Hawthorne hadn't considered. Morrison's shift began at nightfall, and Morrison had a 15-year-old daughter who asked too many questions. Day 210, 7 months without food. Grace O'Malley weighed 86 pounds. She should have been dead. Medical science said so. Hawthorne's poisoned water had never arrived. Morrison had intercepted it, replacing it with plain water, buying time he couldn't explain and Grace couldn't afford. But time was running out. Her body had consumed everything it could sacrifice. Muscle tissue gone. Fat reserves depleted months ago. Now it was cannibalizing organs, dissolving her from the inside. Her heart beat arrhythmically, a clock with broken springs. Her kidneys processed almost nothing. Her liver, swollen and failing, pressed against ribs that showed through skin like piano keys. Yet her mind remained, sharpened by desperation into something crystalline and terrible. Morrison appeared at the slot during night rounds. His face was gray, aged a decade in the weeks since he'd spared her. "They're coming for you tomorrow," he whispered. "Voss has authorized direct intervention. They'll force-feed you, break the hunger strike, eliminate you as a symbol. Let them try." Grace's voice was barely audible, a ghost of sound. "Grace." Morrison's use of her name still startled her. "I can't save you, but I can give you one last chance to speak." He slid something through the slot. Paper, pencil stub, worn nearly to nothing. "Write it down, everything, I'll get it out. I have a cousin, works for the Herald. He's reported on asylum conditions before. If you give me testimony, real testimony, I'll make sure it reaches him." Grace's hands shook so violently she could barely grasp the pencil. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I want to sleep again. Because I want to look my daughter in the eye. Because—" His voice cracked. "Because I'm tired of being the kind of man who watches women die and does nothing." He left her alone with paper and the impossible task of translating 7 months of horror into words. Grace began to write. Her hand cramped immediately. Malnutrition had destroyed fine motor control. The pencil slipped, skittered across paper. She gripped it differently, wedging it between wasted fingers, pressing hard enough to leave impressions in the wood. The first words came slowly. "My name is Grace O'Malley. I am 25 years old. I am not insane." Then faster. "I was committed to Willowbrook Asylum on March 12, 1895, by Dr. Elias Hawthorne. Not for illness, but for witnessing crimes. I saw documentation of experiments. I saw evidence of human trafficking disguised as medical research. I saw the names of women who entered this institution and never left." Her handwriting deteriorated as she wrote, letters growing larger and more erratic as her muscles failed. But she continued. She documented everything. The files she'd read, the 23 women starved before her, the sterilization program, the sale of bodies, the contract between Hawthorne and Voss, the financial arrangements, the names of board members, the dates, the amounts. She wrote about Subject 247, who lasted 87 days, about Margaret Chen, Subject 189, starved for loving the wrong man, about Elizabeth Chen, Subject 278, medicated into forgetting her own daughter's murder. She wrote about Sarah Brennan, the nurse who tried to help and was committed for her compassion. She wrote about her own 7 months of dying, the daily measurements, the clinical observations, the way Voss discussed her deterioration as if she were a fascinating specimen rather than a human being. The pencil grew shorter. Her hand cramped into a claw. She switched to her left hand, though she'd never written left-handed before. The letters were barely legible, but they existed. When the pencil became too short to hold, she wet her finger with water, pressed it into the graphite residue left on paper, and continued writing with her own skin. Then the water ran out. Grace stared at the unfinished testimony. So much left to say. So many names still unspoken. She looked at her hands, skeletal, bruised, trembling. She bit her thumb, hard, until blood welled, used her own blood as ink. The words came out brown-red, smeared and terrible. They are killing us, not quickly, not mercifully, slowly, documented. For profit. This is not medicine. This is murder dressed in white coats and filed in leather ledgers. Her vision blurred. She was fading. The act of writing was consuming her last reserves. She forced herself to continue. To whoever reads this, we were women. We had names. We were inconvenient, so they made us invisible. They diagnosed us with conditions that did not exist. They confined us in places we could not escape. They erased us from official records and sold our bodies to medical schools like livestock. Blood dripped from her thumb onto the page. She didn't wipe it away. Let it stain the testimony. Physical proof. DNA evidence, though the term wouldn't exist for decades. I am dying as I write this. My body has been failing for 7 months, but I die as Grace O'Malley, daughter of Ireland, witness to atrocity, and I will not be forgotten. Remember us. Remember all of us, the women who never returned. She signed it. Grace O'Malley, Subject 341, Willowbrook Asylum for the Feeble-Minded and Insane, November 1895. Beneath her signature, she added one final line, pressing so hard the pencil stub broke. They can erase our names from their ledgers, but they cannot erase the truth. The cell door opened. Morrison stood there, face illuminated by lamplight from the corridor. Grace held out the papers, 17 pages front and back, covered in increasingly illegible handwriting that ended in blood. Morrison took them with reverence usually reserved for religious texts, folded them carefully, tucked them inside his jacket, against his heart. "I'll get them out," he promised. "Tonight, my shift ends at dawn. I'll go straight to the Herald. They'll publish this, I swear it. They'll fire you, possibly arrest you." "I know," Morrison smiled sadly, "but I'll be able to look my daughter in the eye." He turned to leave. Grace called out, a whisper that barely carried. "Morrison, your daughter, what's her name?" "Catherine. Tell her," Grace's voice failed. She tried again. "Tell her some fights are worth losing everything for." Morrison nodded. The door closed. The lock engaged. Grace collapsed onto her mattress. The effort of writing had cost her almost everything left. Her heart stuttered, paused, restarted reluctantly. Her breathing was shallow, labored. She closed her eyes, saw the faces of the women she'd documented. Subject 247, Subject 189, Subject 278. All the numbered dead, their names restored in her testimony. If Morrison kept his promise, if the testimony reached the Herald, if anyone cared enough to investigate, then perhaps dying had been worth it. Day 211. Morning. The slot opened. Not Morrison. Voss stood outside, face twisted with rage barely contained by professional decorum. "Where is it?" His voice was ice. Morrison broke. "Told us everything. Where is your little testimony, Subject 341? Grace smiled, tasted blood in her mouth. "Gone," she whispered. "Beyond your reach. In the hands of people who remember that women are human." Voss struck the door with his fist. "You stupid girl. You think one testimony matters? We'll discredit it. Call it the ravings of a lunatic. Produce our own experts. Bury you and your lies. Then you have nothing to fear." Grace's smile widened, terrible and triumphant. "Unless it's true, unless it can be verified, unless someone investigates and finds the bodies you sold, the records you falsified, the women you erased." Voss opened the door, entered the cell, stood over her prone form. "You won't live to see it. I know." Grace met his eyes. "But I'll die knowing you're afraid. And fear is how truth begins." He left. Grace lay in darkness, her testimony loose in the world, her body shutting down, her heart beating its final measures. She had 1 month left to live. She had just ensured it would matter. The New York Herald, November 28, 1895, page 4. Asylum atrocities alleged. Former orderly claims systematic abuse at Willowbrook Institution. Patient testimony describes starvation experiments, unlawful deaths. The article ran 2,000 words. Included extensive quotes from Grace's testimony, named names, cited dates, provided specific allegations that could be investigated, verified, or, as Hawthorne and Voss hoped, discredited. Within Willowbrook's walls, panic metastasized like infection. Day 215. Grace heard it through her cell door, raised voices, rapid footsteps, the sound of furniture being moved, records being relocated, evidence being destroyed. Voss appeared at her slot, face contorted with controlled fury. "Congratulations. Your little testimony has caused quite a stir. The Board of Governors is demanding explanations. The State Medical Board is threatening an inspection." He smiled without warmth. "But here's what's going to happen. We'll produce our own records. Demonstrate that you're a documented paranoid schizophrenic with a history of elaborate delusions. We'll show your deteriorated mental state, your refusal of treatment, your obvious insanity." "Show them the bodies," Grace whispered. "Show them the women who died here. Match their deaths to my testimony. We've already prepared death certificates, natural causes, all properly documented and filed with the city. Your testimony is just one mad woman's fantasy." But his voice carried an edge Grace recognized: fear. The slot closed. Grace lay back, conserving the energy required simply to breathe. Her body had entered its final phase. Organs were failing sequentially, like lights going out in a vast building. Soon, there would be only darkness. Day 218. Morrison's cousin, the journalist who'd published the testimony, was found dead in his apartment. Official cause: suicide by laudanum overdose. Unofficial whispers, suspicious timing, no history of melancholia. A man who'd seemed vigorous and engaged with life the day before. Morrison himself disappeared. His daughter Catherine reported him missing. Police investigated half-heartedly. A week later, his body washed up on the banks of the Hudson. Accidental drowning, they said. No evidence of foul play. Grace learned this through whispers in corridors, through conversations overheard during her increasingly rare conscious moments. Each death was a message: silence or die. But the testimony had escaped. It lived beyond Morrison, beyond Grace, beyond Willowbrook's ability to contain it. Day 223. The first inspection. Grace heard them, official voices, demanding access, citing legal authority. She heard Voss's smooth responses, the sound of a man accustomed to managing inquiries. Her cell door opened. 2 men in suits entered, accompanied by Voss and a nervous-looking stenographer. "This is Subject 341, Voss explained. "The patient who made the allegations. As you can see, she's in severe physical decline due to persistent refusal of nourishment. A common presentation in cases of severe hysteria with delusional ideation." One inspector leaned close to Grace. "Miss O'Malley, can you hear me?" Grace opened her eyes, focused with effort. The inspector's face swam into clarity. Older man, gray beard, eyes that had seen too many institutions to be easily shocked. "Yes," she breathed. "The testimony published in the Herald. Did you write it?" "Yes." "And do you stand by its contents?" Grace smiled. "Tasted copper. Every word. Checked the basement storage room. They moved bodies through there, sold them. Records in the 3rd filing cabinet. Financial ledgers. Contracts with medical schools," Voss interjected smoothly. "As you can see, she continues to exhibit paranoid delusions. There are no bodies, no secret ledgers. We maintain complete and transparent records of all patient deaths." "Then you won't mind if we examine those records," the inspector said coldly. "And the storage areas, and the financial accounts. Thoroughly?" Voss's smile froze. The inspection lasted 6 hours. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, but even in her fugue state, she heard the sounds of discovery. Filing cabinets being opened, papers rustling, sharp intakes of breath. They found the basement storage room, found traces of what it had been used for, bloodstains poorly cleaned, hooks on the ceiling that had no legitimate medical purpose, drain in the floor designed for fluid disposal. They found the financial records Voss hadn't managed to destroy in time. Payments from medical schools, receipts for specimens, discrepancies between reported and actual deaths. They found, in a locked cabinet in Voss's office, the original contract Grace had described. Hawthorne's signature bold and clear at the bottom. Day 225. Voss was placed under immediate suspension pending investigation. Hawthorne, warned by telegram, fled New York. Boarded a ship for England, hoping to disappear into London's medical community where questions about American scandals would not follow. He was arrested before the ship cleared harbor. Extradited. Charged. Grace heard about it through Sarah Brennan, who'd been released from patient status the moment inspectors discovered a nurse had been committed for attempting to report institutional abuse. Sarah appeared at Grace's cell, no longer wearing institutional gray, but her own clothes. She'd lost weight, aged years in weeks, but her eyes were clear. "They're shutting it down," she whispered through the slot. "Willowbrook, the whole institution. Every patient is being transferred or released. The Board of Governors is being investigated. There are warrants for Voss, Hawthorne, and 6 others." Grace tried to speak, managed only. "Morrison?" Sarah's face fell. "Dead. They killed him, Grace, him and the journalist. But they couldn't kill what you wrote. It's everywhere now. Other papers picked it up. Families of former patients are coming forward. The scandal is..." She paused. "It's enormous." "Good," Grace whispered. "They want to move you to a hospital, real hospital. Try to save you." Grace shook her head slightly. "Too late." "Grace, I'm ready." Grace's lips curved into something almost peaceful. "I did what I came here to do. The rest is for the living." Sarah's tears fell through the slot. "You shouldn't have had to die for us to listen." "Someone always does." Grace closed her eyes. "Just make sure it mattered." Day 230. December 15th, 1895. 8 months since Grace had eaten. She lay in her cell, no longer locked, but she lacked strength to leave it, drifting between consciousness and something else. Not quite dreams. Memories, perhaps, or visions, or the final hallucinations of a brain starved of oxygen. She saw her mother on the Irish coast, hanging laundry that would never dry in the Atlantic wind. She saw Subject 247, Subject 189, all the numbered women, their names restored, their deaths accounted for. She saw Morrison's daughter Catherine reading the Herald article, understanding why her father had died. She saw the future, dimly, impossibly, saw institutions changing, saw laws written, saw women given voices, saw her testimony become evidence, become history, become memory. Outside her cell, she heard singing, not real singing. The other patients, freed from their wards, were wandering the corridors in confused liberation. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stood in doorways, uncertain what freedom meant after years of captivity. One woman, Grace never learned her name, stood outside Grace's cell and sang a hymn in a language Grace didn't recognize. Armenian, perhaps, or Greek. The melody was ancient, meant for mourning. Grace's heart beat slower, then slower still. Her last thought was not of suffering or justice or vindication. It was simply, "I had a name. Grace O'Malley. Remember." Her heart stopped at 3:47 p.m. No one was present to document the exact moment, but the absence was noted. New York State Supreme Court, March 1896, 3 months after Grace O'Malley's death. The courtroom was built for spectacle, high ceilings, oak paneling, windows that cast judgment in bars of light across the defendant's table. Every seat filled. Journalists crowded the gallery. Sketch artists captured faces for newspapers that had turned the Willowbrook scandal into serialized horror. The people of the state of New York versus Elias Hawthorne and Reginald Voss. Charges: murder in the second degree, 23 counts. Conspiracy to defraud. Unlawful experimentation on human subjects. Falsification of medical records. Sale of human remains without consent. Criminal negligence resulting in death. District Attorney Thomas Brennan, no relation to Sarah, delivered the opening statement with the precision of a surgeon opening an infected wound. Gentlemen of the jury, what you will hear in this courtroom will challenge your faith in institutions, in medicine, in the very concept of care. He held up a document. Grace's testimony now entered as State's Exhibit A. This is the last written words of Grace O'Malley, a 25-year-old woman who died of starvation while confined in an asylum that promised treatment but delivered torture. He read portions aloud. The courtroom listened in silence, broken only by the scratch of pencils on paper, journalists recording every word. Subject 247, aged 19, died after 87 days of enforced starvation. Subject 189, Margaret Chen, 16 years old, starved for 71 days for the crime of loving someone her family disapproved of. Subject 278, Elizabeth Chen, medicated into forgetting her own daughter's murder. Brennan placed the testimony on the evidence table. Miss O'Malley wrote this in her final days, first with pencil, then with her own blood when the pencil broke. She knew she was dying. She chose to die documenting their crimes rather than live in silence. He turned to the jury. The defense will argue that Miss O'Malley was mentally ill, that her testimony is the product of delusion. But here is what they cannot argue. The bodies are real. The financial records are real. The contract between these two men, he pointed at Hawthorne and Voss, to profit from human suffering is real. Signed, dated, notarized. The trial proceeded with the grinding machinery of justice. Sarah Brennan testified, described conditions inside Willowbrook, detailed the retaliation she'd faced for showing compassion. Her voice never wavered, but her hands gripped the witness rail white-knuckled. I watched Grace O'Malley die over 8 months. It wasn't passive observation. It was active documentation. Dr. Voss measured her deterioration like a scientist studying decay. He was proud of how long she lasted. The defense attorney, a man named Crowley, whose reputation for defending the indefensible was legendary, cross-examined aggressively. Miss Brennan, isn't it true that you yourself were committed as a patient? That you were diagnosed with delusional sympathy disorder? I was diagnosed after I tried to smuggle Grace's testimony out. It was retaliation disguised as medicine. Or was it a legitimate medical intervention for a nurse who'd become too emotionally attached to a patient? Sarah's voice turned to steel. They committed me to silence me, just like they committed Grace to erase her. The difference is I survived. Catherine Morrison testified. 16 years old, orphaned by her father's murder, she held Morrison's final letter, written the night he delivered Grace's testimony to the Herald. He wrote, I'm doing something that will cost me everything, but it's the only way I can live with myself. Tell your mother I love her. Tell yourself that some truths are worth dying for. Catherine's voice broke. They found him in the river 3 days later. The defense suggested Morrison's death was unrelated. Catherine's look could have cut glass. My father worked at Willowbrook for 11 years without incident. He exposes systematic murder and dies within a week. You expect this jury to believe that's coincidence? The medical examiner testified. Brought photographs, Grace's autopsy, conducted by the state after her death. The images were not shown to the public, but their contents were described in clinical detail. Subject exhibited complete organ failure consistent with prolonged starvation. Heart rate reduced by 40%. Liver showed extensive necrosis. Kidneys non-functional. Muscle tissue essentially absent. Bone marrow depleted. She survived 8 months through what can only be described as extraordinary physiological resilience, combined with absolute determination. In your medical opinion, could she have been saved at any point? Until approximately month 6, yes. Standard refeeding protocols could have reversed the damage. After that point, the organ damage was too extensive. But here's the critical finding. The examiner held up a report. We found evidence of multiple injection sites. Analysis of tissue samples revealed digitalis, morphine, and other substances. Someone was administering drugs, ostensibly to keep her alive, but at dosages that would prolong suffering rather than provide comfort. Voss shifted in his seat. Hawthorne remained motionless. The prosecution introduced the financial records. An accountant spent 3 hours explaining the discrepancies between reported deaths and actual patient mortality, between stated institutional expenses and real costs, between charitable donations and experimental funding. Over 6 years, Willowbrook received $127,000 in donations designated for patient care. Of that amount, $89,000 is unaccounted for. However, we found corresponding payments totaling $87,000 from medical schools, pharmaceutical companies, and private research initiatives for specimen acquisition. The contract Grace had found was authenticated by handwriting experts. Hawthorne's signature matched samples from his published medical papers. Voss's matched hospital administrative documents. The defense called their own experts, psychiatrists who testified that Grace was indeed mentally ill, that her testimony was consistent with paranoid delusion, that her refusal to eat was itself evidence of insanity. "A sane person doesn't starve themselves to death," one expert proclaimed. The prosecution recalled Sarah Brennan. "Miss Brennan, you knew Grace O'Malley. In your professional opinion as a trained nurse, was she insane?" "She was the sanest person in that building. She knew exactly what she was doing. She chose starvation as testimony because she knew her death would force investigation. She weaponized her own suffering to expose institutional murder." Sarah looked at the jury. "That's not insanity. That's martyrdom." The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Verdict: guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison, a man who'd presided over the bench for 30 years, addressed the defendants before sentencing. "I have seen many criminals in this courtroom, thieves, violent men, murderers driven by passion or greed. But I have never encountered evil quite like this. Evil that dressed itself in the robes of medicine, that claimed benevolence while inflicting torture, that kept meticulous records of its own atrocities as if documentation somehow legitimized murder." He paused. The courtroom held its breath. "You exploited the most vulnerable among us. You silenced women whose only crime was being inconvenient. You profited from suffering. You turned institutions meant for healing into abattoirs, and you did it all with the confidence of men who believed their education and social standing placed them beyond accountability." Sentence: death by hanging. Both defendants. To be carried out within 60 days. Hawthorne wept. Voss remained impassive. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some cheered. Others prayed. Catherine Morrison stood on the steps holding her father's letter and wept for justice that came too late. Inside the courtroom, Sarah Brennan placed a single white rose on the evidence table, next to Grace's blood-stained testimony. "For the women who never returned," she whispered. The reporters wrote it down. It became the epitaph for every woman erased by institutional violence, every woman who died to expose truth, every inconvenient witness who refused to disappear quietly into the dark. Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York, May 14th, 1896. 6:47 a.m. Dr. Elias Hawthorne was hanged first. The rope broke his neck cleanly. Death was instantaneous, more mercy than he'd ever shown his patients. The witnesses reported he went silently. No final words, no confession. Dr. Reginald Voss followed at 7:03 a.m. He spoke before the hood was placed. "History will vindicate our research. Science requires sacrifice." No one recorded whether anyone agreed. The executions made front-page news for 2 days, then faded as New York moved to newer scandals, fresher horrors. The public's attention span for institutional atrocity proved finite, but some things did not fade. Official record: Willowbrook Asylum closure. June 1896. The institution was shuttered by state order. 347 patients were transferred to other facilities or released to family care. The building itself was sold, repurposed, eventually demolished in 1923. No marker indicates what it had been. The remaining staff faced varying fates. Some were investigated. Most were quietly dismissed. A few, those who'd actively participated in experiments, faced criminal charges. None received sentences comparable to Hawthorne and Voss. Complicity, it seemed, was less punishable than authority. Morrison's family received a small pension from the state, compensation for his service in exposing corruption. His daughter Catherine became a journalist, specializing in investigative reporting on institutional abuse. She spent 40 years documenting conditions in asylums, prisons, and sanitariums. Never married, never forgot. Sarah Brennan left nursing, became an advocate for patient rights, testified before state legislatures, helped draft the first laws requiring independent oversight of psychiatric institutions, died in 1954, age 89, surrounded by files documenting 50 years of advocacy. Her last words, "Are they still listening?" Grace O'Malley, final accounting. No family claimed her body. The state provided burial in Potter's Field, Hart Island, where New York's unclaimed dead were interred in mass graves. No headstone, no marker. But her testimony survived. The New York Herald published it in full, 17 pages reprinted verbatim. Other newspapers followed. Medical journals debated it. Reform advocates cited it. The testimony became evidence, became history, became the foundation for institutional reform. The O'Malley Act passed the New York State Legislature in 1897, requiring regular inspections of psychiatric facilities, mandating patient advocacy systems, criminalizing medical experimentation without consent, and establishing penalties for falsification of death certificates. Similar laws spread to other states. Not quickly, not comprehensively, but Grace's death had cracked something open. The women who never returned. Archives contain their names now, not numbers, names. Subject 247 was Anna Kowalski, 19, Polish immigrant, committed for moral deficiency after refusing to marry a man 3 times her age, starved for 87 days, body sold to Cornell Medical College for $52. Subject 189 was Margaret Chen, 16, born in New York to Chinese immigrants, committed for nymphomania, the diagnosis given to any woman whose sexuality displeased her family, starved for 71 days, body sold for $47. Subject 278 was Elizabeth Chen, Margaret's mother, committed after she tried to investigate her daughter's death, kept medicated into compliance for 3 years, released after Willowbrook's closure, lived until 1903, never fully recovered her memory. The list continued. 23 women before Grace, hundreds more across the nation in similar institutions, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, erased by systems designed to silence inconvenient voices. Grace's testimony gave them documentation, gave them names, gave them a witness who refused to be silenced even by death. Fragmented evidence, declassified, 1963. A historian researching progressive-era medical reform discovered a box of papers in a Manhattan basement, correspondence between asylum administrators and state officials, discussing strategies to manage the Willowbrook scandal. One letter, dated April 1896, from an unnamed official to the governor's office. The O'Malley affair has generated unfortunate publicity, but the underlying issues remain unchanged. Institutions require discretion to manage difficult populations. While we cannot condone the extremes documented at Willowbrook, we must be cautious that reform does not hamper legitimate medical authority. Inconvenient individuals, particularly women prone to hysteria, still require institutional management. We simply must be more careful about documentation. The reforms had limits. The hunger for control persisted. Modern epilogue. Psychiatric institutions still exist. Some provide genuine care, others warehouse the mentally ill. Abuse still occurs, less overt, better hidden, carefully documented to avoid liability. Women are still diagnosed at higher rates than men, still committed more readily, still medicated into compliance. The language has changed. Hysteria became borderline personality disorder. Moral insanity became antisocial behavior. But the underlying impulse to pathologize female resistance remains. Grace O'Malley would recognize the patterns. Her testimony sits in archives now, preserved behind climate-controlled glass. Scholars study it. Documentary filmmakers reference it. It has become historical artifact, sanitized by distance, reduced to footnote in medical ethics textbooks. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, someone reads it and understands. A nurse notices patterns of overmedication in a facility. A social worker questions why certain patients never receive visitors. A journalist investigates unexplained deaths in institutional care. And they remember, Grace O'Malley starved herself to death to force the world to see. Her hunger was never about food, it was about justice. And justice is never satisfied. It requires constant feeding, constant vigilance, constant resistance, constant refusal to accept that institutional authority justifies individual suffering. Hart Island, New York, Potter's Field, Section 33, grave unmarked. In 2019, a group of historians and activists placed a memorial stone. Grace O'Malley, 1870-1895. Witness, martyr, remembered. She starved so others might speak. Beneath it, they added the names of the 23 women documented in her testimony. And beneath those, a single line. For all the women who never returned. The memorial was vandalized twice, repaired both times. Now maintained by volunteers who understand that remembering is resistance. That documentation is defiance. That the hunger for truth never dies. It simply waits for those brave enough to feed it. Postscript. A note found in Catherine Morrison's papers, 1962. I often think about Grace O'Malley. Never met her. She died before my father's testimony brought her story to light. But I've spent my life following the path she carved, exposing institutions, documenting abuse, giving voice to the silenced. People ask why I never married, never had children. The truth? I did have children, hundreds of them. Every woman I helped free from institutional captivity. Every patient whose story I documented. Every reform I helped push through. Grace taught me something essential. The most powerful weapon against injustice is not violence or protest or political maneuvering. It's testimony. It's documentation. It's the refusal to let them erase you from the record. She weaponized her own death, made her suffering into evidence, turned her body into testimony. That's not insanity. That's what courage looks like when you have nothing left but your voice and the absolute determination to be heard. I'm 78 years old now, dying of cancer. My time is short. But I've documented 347 cases of institutional abuse, published 89 investigative reports, helped close 23 facilities, testified before Congress 4 times. None of it brings back the dead. None of it undoes the suffering. But it keeps their names alive, keeps their stories documented, keeps the hunger for justice fed. Grace, wherever you are, Potter's Field or heaven or nowhere at all, I hope you know, we remembered, we're still remembering, and as long as we remember, you never truly died. The women who never returned are returning, in archives, in testimony, in every reform we fight for, every abuse we expose, every institution we force to acknowledge that the inconvenient deserve dignity. Your hunger became ours, and we will not stop feeding it until justice is satisfied. In a world that tried to erase them, women who never returned remembers.